You're watching the A250 interviews, and I'm Louise Dubé, CEO of iCivics. This series uses the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, our 250th anniversary, to have nuanced conversation about the state of our democratic republic. Today, I'm joined by Ben Ginsberg. Ben is one of the nation's leading experts on election law and was involved in one of the most consequential election disputes, election moments, the Florida recount in 2000. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Ben, you were, as some have said, present at the creation of this new era of contested elections. Can you take us back there for a moment? Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in the 2000 election, what your role was, and what we should learn from it today?
Well, Louise, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here, and the mission of iCivics is so important to the future of the country. So when it comes to voting, it is one of the basic institutions. I think that contentions over elections have been with us far before what happened in Florida, although Florida was certainly a pinpoint, but for decades and decades, there have been close contested elections. The winners went away happy, the losers went away sad. Certainly in the act of voting, there has been long time disagreement over whether it should be really, really easy to vote, or if making it really, really easy to vote lets people who aren't uh, uh, credited voters come in to vote, thereby diluting the votes of all uh, proper voters. So that's been a long running debate between the parties and between people in individual states and sometimes between regions, so that when Florida came about, it grabbed the attention, sort of sucked up the oxygen from that long running debate. Because who would ever think there would be a presidential election that came down to 537 votes out of more than 5 million cast in one single state? So, not surprisingly, and consistent with the history of recounts, that was really fiercely contested, with the winners being happy and the losers being sad. Um, 537 votes is really it's particularly agonizing when you appreciate the way our voting system evolved. We do very, very local elections. In fact, we made a policy decision 240 years ago that our elections would be local. That means today, experts in elections cannot even tell you the number of jurisdictions that are responsible for the casting, counting, and certification of votes. It's somewhere between 8 and 10,000. Nobody's quite sure how many, but if you have 8 or 10,000 of anything, you will have inconsistencies between them. That's just human nature. And so when Florida happened, all that got sort of focused on one state with 67 counties who clearly did not do everything quite together in a 537 vote race. Al Gore did what must have been one of the most difficult things ever in politics, which is to graciously concede for the good of the country that he lost the election. And he deserves enormous credit for that, and to Democrats do for accepting the results of a narrow victory. I was George W. Bush's counsel during the recount. I know that if, in fact, we had fallen behind, we would have fought like the Dickens to win. But at the end of the day, if the results were cast, Governor Bush would have conceded too. Um, but that's a little bit different from the way things are today. But what Florida really did was make election law and litigation over elections sort of much more commonplace.
Wow. So, as you say, as you point out, we've had controversy around elections for a very long time. I think to the nation, this particular contest felt different. It was elevated to Supreme Court. Um, but as you point out, it was resolved by Al Gore conceding in the face of, what ended up being
Well, it was
validated
resolved by
results.
the final count.
Yes.
That's how
Well, that
resolved it.
too. Yes. But I guess what I'm left puzzled is if you were an educator today teaching about that period or about voting in general, would you consider the 2000 election to be the beginning of some greater level of polarization, or did that start later?
Oh, well, first of all, let me say that blaming politics alone for polarization is, I think, not not correct. I think that it's happened under polarization has increased under a whole bunch of cultural and educational and political issues, but polarization is caused by politics. I do think that the 2000 election is really instructive for teachers of civics and government. I mean, after all, there could not be a starker example of the fundamental of our country, which is every vote counts. And if you have a presidential race decided by 537 votes, then that means it is a perfect example for students and for anybody else that you need to participate in the government, and I think it's a great lesson in that both sides can really fight hard for their positions, but then learn to accept a result at the end. And the process was better for the fact that both sides had extremely talented lawyers and leaders. Ultimate results come out better when each side is able to make its best argument and bounce them back and forth and and come to an agreement. I think it's also a great lesson because despite the closeness of the election and the partisan bitterness, the country came together at the end. There was a lot of talk as the recount concluded about how the country would be torn apart. There were never troops in the streets or tanks in the streets, and that the Supreme Court would lose a great deal of credibility for jumping in and being sure the country didn't devolve into chaos. And there was no indication that the court's role in the U.S. faded at all because of what it did in Bush versus Gore.
So you agree with their taking the case at the Supreme Court then?
Yeah, I do. I think that the to play out what would have happened if they hadn't, and that we might not have had somebody sworn in by January 20th, which is the day the U.S. Constitution says you need a president, that would have taken us into a chaotic situation, which would not at all have benefited the country.
Right. And so let's go back. I was struck with the numbers that you cited, even by the fact that you're saying that we can't even count how many jurisdictions there are. 8 to 10,000 means a lot of different ways for to run elections. Eh, If you were a teacher today, it's very hard to teach that great scope of that. Is that what do you think about such a system? And what do you think? Is it good because it's resilient, because it's done a lot of different ways, or is it bad because we don't have a centralized way to do it that's supported federally?
Well, I think one of the essential truths of elections and administering elections, and I had some experience with this as a co-chair with a Democratic colleague of mine in the Presidential Commission on Election Administration a decade ago, is that one size does not fit all in elections. That we are a very richly diverse country with all sorts of different jurisdictions needing ways to put on elections and to handle it for what's best in their community. So, on the one hand, I do not think that there should be one way to run elections, but I do think more uniformity should be a goal and sort of take care of the equal protection concerns that did get raised in Florida and certainly could again. I think to preserve the basic federalist nature of the country is that the sort of greater uniformity and consolidation should take place among states, which can recognize within that the differences that are needed for large jurisdictions and small jurisdictions and urban jurisdictions and suburban jurisdictions and rural jurisdictions.
Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is that even though we have a very decentralized system that is you can't have one answer for every situation, you do call for a sort of a more standardized. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be everything controlled locally or everything controlled centrally. It can be just some more uniformity in the machines or the kinds of
Yeah,
processes. Okay.
yeah, I think so.
Okay. Um, let's go back. You said that the Florida election in 2000 made the case for civic participation, meaning that your vote counts. So, what would you say to someone who thinks their vote doesn't count because there's so much quote unquote corruption or election disintegrity in the system? What would be your answer to that? I know you've been around the country and you've talked to a lot of people about that. We'd love to hear that experience and how you make the case for it.
The voting system is broad and vast, and so there are times that people can feel lost in it. One of the strengths of having so many jurisdictions involved in voting is that it is a very community-based effort. I find that even people who are skeptical, as you described, do recognize that who is elected, who runs the government, does matter. And so I think it is a combination of recognizing all the different things that local, state, federal government do and impact people's lives. But it is important to sort of start out with that basic civic framework of really understanding what your government does, from picking up the trash to providing benefits over a whole range of things, to just being sure that when you drive down the street at night, the stoplights work, and so you can cross the street or you can go through without crashing your car. Government is an essential part of our lives, and it's important to understand those. And in terms of voting, people who say the election system is corrupted, um, it is a very community, local based activity. And, you know, you can become involved and see for yourself instead of believing sort of louder voices who may not there's not an election system that doesn't want volunteers to help run the polls. I find that election officials uh, understand the value of transparency, and so will give tours to classes about the election system. And it's kind of pretty cool to see all those big machines and the way they can sort and count and keep track of what's going on. So I think it is a matter of taking what seems like a big, sort of impenetrable nationwide mass and understanding that it starts very much down on the community level and that there are ways to observe and participate both in your communities.
So what I hear you say to our teachers is really you have to make the case that this matters because your government matters to you, to your particular life, and that this is your community running it. This is not some people outside of it, but
Your
also,
friends and neighbors.
yeah, and your friends and neighbors. And then also maybe just show them, just take them to a poll or any of them to see. But just to press on that just a little bit more, the voting machine themselves, they've been the target of a lot of concerns by a lot of people. And those things are, it's hard to get inside of it. Like when you have a manually marked ballot, it's a lot easier. So how do you deal with that? How do you build confidence in that?
Yeah, so they do seem kind of like a black box that nobody understands. Um, In fact, your election administrators are really pretty willing and have come to realize in the last few years the value of explaining all that. Now, as a procedural matter, in every jurisdiction, there are tests that are done on every machine just before the election. They're called logic and accuracy tests, and they're open to the public. And what that comes down to is that they will test vote. They'll come up with a number of ballots and run them through the machine to be sure the machine has calibrated it properly. And so you can watch those tests being done. After the election, more and more jurisdictions, but not every jurisdiction, do post-election audits, and so they recount a certain number of ballots in the district. That's open to the public and can be observed. Go down to the polls.
Yeah. Many of our partner organizations do that. It's a fantastic exercise. So, does that process of transparency over the last many years after the January 2020 election, do you believe that we have turned a corner or raised the level of trust that Americans have in the voting system, or is that still a problem?
But I think it is still an issue. I mean, what the last two presidential elections would suggest is that your faith in election depends on whether your candidate wins or not. So, there were lots of complaints after the 2020 election. In 2024, all the pre-election suits got dropped after the results came out. You didn't hear anybody challenging the accuracy of elections. The polls have showed that Democrats' distrust in the accuracy of elections has now risen since 2024. So I think as the question about reliability is still very present in many minds. And it is important for people to kick the tires of their election systems to be able to see for themselves whether the allegations are accurate or not.
Do you believe that the integrity of the electoral system as a whole has improved outside of whether people trust it or not, or has it remained relatively the same over the course of these many years?
I believe as a tech the system is much more secure, transparent, and safe than it's been in the past. I mean, Florida was also a wake up call that our election infrastructure was outdated. But I do think that between uh, 2020 and now, election administrators have become much more aware of the need for transparency. The caveat, of course, is that it is a very human system, right? We with the polls are run on election day by volunteers, many of them even older than I am, if that's possible. And they only do that work a couple of times every other year. So it is still a human system. And so mistakes can happen, as in really anything. Um, but I do believe that overall we have safe and secure elections that are much better. And of course, as these elections have come under assault, there's been no proof in any of the over 100 lawsuits that have been filed of any systemic failures in the accuracy of the election system. But there is human error from time to time.
Right. If you had to name the highest need for election integrity, what would you invest in? What's the biggest need?
I would invest in two things really. Better technology. I mean, I think the technology can always been improved, can always be improved. We are a mobile society. People move, people die. And one of the areas that people wonder about is non-qualified voters being able to cast ballots. There are certainly improvements that can be made that way. The other area of investment is in election officials, professionalizing what they do and what their training is certainly important. Better pay, and in the sort of discord of the last few years, there's an increased problem with physical safety for election officials.
Oh,
Should
right.
certainly be addressed.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to go and focus in straight into what was a standard. They're now on hold, but in Oklahoma, there was a standard that required educators to teach about the sudden stop in vote counts in the 2020 election. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What are they talking about? And how do elections normally work? And is that was there a sudden stop in the counting?
There were no, well, there was litigation over each of the allegations of sudden stops. There were 64 court cases filed in 6 battleground states after that election. The sudden stops were part of that, part of the litigation in a number of cases. Absolutely zero came out of the allegations in courts of law. So, in a situation like that, everyone has an absolute right to litigate questions that they may feel. Every state has recount provisions and contest provisions. You've got every right to be able to question things that you think aren't right. But then you have to accept the results afterwards. And the premise of what happened in O was a rejection of what our court system found and the use of the word discrepancies to sort of launch those standards. And there were never any discrepancies found or proven. So I think I think that was a problem. After what was talked about in those standards about interruptions in votes, um, is not consistent with the way the system works and the way people beforehand the system was going to work. And what happens is in states where there are absentee ballots collected at the precinct level, the procedure of the state is to count the ballots, is to collect the ballots at the precinct level. And then after the counts are done in the precincts, then those precincts send their absentee ballots or mail ballots to a central location. And so there is a difference in time of that's come in. And they can be for some very large voting jurisdictions. So a big city that has a central count will always get large sort of submissions from the individual precincts of uncounted absentee mail ballots late at night. And that was sort of the fake allegations and the spliced together films were created, none of which were proven in a court of law.
Yeah. So it sounds to me as though what you're telling our educators is to actually educate on the very clear and structured look at the entire night and what happens precinct by precinct and how this is part of a normal course of counting votes.
I also think that what the Oklahoma situation points out is an interesting teaching point, which is in the election, you heard two very different versions of what happened and whether the counting was reliable or not. And it is possible to go through and recognize that there are different points of view on a contentious issue and that there are ways to get to an end result one way or another without yelling and screaming and real contention. So, I mean, throughout our history, there have been deeply contested issues with people having passionate views on both sides. And really, one of the secrets of the country over time, I think, has been we've been able to argue out those positions, to talk across the aisle, and then to come up with a compromise decision or a decision that people realize is just sort of right factually. And so talking about the 2020 election, while really difficult, is one of those points in history that can be a really good object lesson for teachers.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point. What you're pointing out is like there are controversies in this area, and even if we are able to argue and talk about them and resolve them, right? So it's not you can't let the situation hang. You need to actually debate it, look at the evidence, and learn something from it. So that's always really important for educators to know that they can do that.
Yeah,
So
two wildly opposing points of view festering under the surface and not being exposed to the other point of view is what leads to discord and dysfunction.
right. Well, there goes a lawyer, a very good one. So we that's what we expect. I'm just to ask you a couple more things. The first one is about the multitude of proposals to reform elections, and not only the actual voting process, but gerrymandering, which is in the news every day these days, providing water in line, voter IDs, all these things. And of everything, ranked choice voting, of all of these proposals, is there one that you think would have the greatest impact to the integrity and trust in our election?
Well, I think it's probably none of those actually. I think it's really much more transparency and sort of breaking down the overall polarized bubbles in which we're existing these days and problematic. I mean, you talked about redistricting. Redistricting is only for the U.S. House of Representatives that we're talking about, and it's a bad phenomenon to take away contested districts is sort of a bad thing. But that the House is indeed a polarized body, but so is the U.S. Senate. I mean, today there are only 9 senators have won election from their party when the presidential candidate of the other party won it. We have an incredible amount of trifectas, right, where one party controls the state. 23, 23 Republican states, 15 Democratic states, close to even number of population, people coming under states controlled by one party. There's a great book called The Big Sort by a University of Texas demographer named Bill Bishop that points out that over the last 50 years, people have tended to live in communities more with people like themselves. It's really hard to draw competitive districts if people are living with people like themselves, which is part of the whole redistricting thing. I think that reforms that are going to work, they need to be sort of mutually agreed on by both parties. The Electoral Count Reform Act that was passed to deal with the actions of the Congress post-election is an example of that. But many of the reforms you mentioned come from one party, and it's an attempt to change the rules to benefit can't win elections under the current rules. And so that's not the way to reform and make people buy into their government. It's got to be bipartisan agreement on those issues, and none of those reforms that you mentioned enjoy bipartisan support now.
Oh, I think it's a really important point. What you're making is that we got to get out of our own polarization. That's what it sounds like. So, as opposed to try to fix it in some with some technical fix, is what I hear
Yeah.
you say. Yeah. And that's very important. So if it's not ranked choice voting, what is it that gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is that I co-chair a nonprofit with a Democratic colleague of mine, somebody I battled for 40 years in some of these really tough election cases. But we both recognize the importance of the system. And I think where we see a great deal of hope in the country is at the local level, in communities. The national debate is extraordinarily poisonous. It is in, interestingly enough, the most contentious election jurisdictions that are close electorally, where we go in and bring people from across the political spectrum together with election officials to kick the tires of the election system. And if we find something, we fix it. If we don't, we ask for people to validate the system. And it's on that local community level where they're not care more about their kids and their communities and their neighbors, as opposed to the more poisonous political atmosphere, that real change can occur and much more sort of a well-run, uniform, non-polarized government and environment can take place.
Well, that's a great place to end. Do you see young people attend those? And how do we get young people in that?
We are branching out this time to include young people in our programs in these contentious election jurisdictions, because that is really important and part of what the importance of the civics movement is. So we will now be recruiting young people to come in as well.
Oh, that's a fantastic news. I think we all feel a little bit better after this conversation that we're in good hands, your hands specifically. So let's have dare I say, not too contentious election on next Tuesday, and then look forward to more and more elections in which we can build community trust in our electoral voting system. With that, thank you so very much, Ben, for joining us and helping educate us about the process of election and all of the related issues. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.